Joining me now from New York is political writer Keli Goff. Keli Goff, welcome. Now, we've heard a lot about this enthusiasm gap in the US. Are you enthused?
I'm enthused, but that's because, for me, I know nothing about football, basketball, soccer. I follow politics. So for me, I'm enthused.
Okay, so putting aside for one moment the likely outcome of this election, has the election campaign and the ads in particular given you hope that you have an inspiring group of political people getting into the political game, or led you to despair?
I wouldn't call them inspiring. I would call them I would call them anything but inspiring. Amusing, embarrassing, depressing, but I don't know that I would use the word inspiring. Because so many of the ads end up being attack ads, right? So instead of telling you what that person's going to do, you end up hearing ads about how terrible the other person is and how their own mother wouldn't even vote for them if they had the chance, right? That's a little bit of what they tend to put up on the airwaves. And what's interesting is in the last year or so, particularly the last year, I would say, we've seen an increase in the number of ads created strictly for the internet. So they're intended to go viral, as we say here, where they're intended to catch someone like me, catch my attention, and then convince me to share it with a bunch of people. So they're actually getting sillier and sillier and using things like animation and getting more ridiculous. And then, of course, I play right into their hands by going on television and talking about how ridiculous they are, which gives the person more attention. We're seeing a lot of that this year.
We might just play one of those ads now that caught your attention during the campaign, the Tea Party-backed candidate Christine O'Donnell, who had to deal with a witchcraft scandal.
I'm not a witch. I'm nothing you've heard. I'm you. None of us are perfect, but none of us can be happy with what we see all around us. Politicians who think spending, trading favors, and backroom deals are the ways to stay in office. I'll go to Washington and do what you'd do. I'm Christine O'Donnell, and I approve this message. I'm you.
Christine O'Donnell now. Now back to Keli Goff in New York. Doesn't that make you want to run out and vote for Christine O'Donnell?
I'd like to say for the record, she is not me. I just want that on the record. She is not me. But the really funny thing about this ad is I wrote a piece about some of the worst ads, and this surprisingly made the list, not surprisingly actually. And the funny thing about it is, as I explained in my article, that when I first heard that she had an ad saying I'm not a witch, I thought, oh, that's terrific. She's making fun of all the people who are picking on her, and she's poking her nose at all of the ridiculous people who are trying to make this a campaign issue. How good for her. She's really funny. And then I saw the ad and realized, no, she's seriously trying to convince voters that she doesn't practice witchcraft. If you're starting from a point, I can't speak for other countries, but in this country, if you're trying to convince a voter first and foremost that you're not a witch, you've probably already lost the argument. That's just what I think.
I'd love a bit of a witchcraft scandal in Australian politics, something to spice things up a bit. Now, how much of a factor has big corporate advertising been in this? Because there was a recent court decision that Barack Obama was particularly worried about in relation to the amount of money that big corporations can spend on advertising during these campaigns.
Right. Well, there's some good news and bad news on that front, I would say, for the president and Democrats and anyone who feels strongly about campaign finance reform. You're right, there was that ruling that a lot of people have a problem with, which allows unlimited amounts of money to be spent by corporations and unions, and a lot of the big, what we call here special interests. The interesting thing is there was actually an update today here in America where the Supreme Court declined, as of today, to hear follow-up on that case, a follow-up case that also had to do with campaign finance reform, which means that the rest of the campaign finance reform laws here will to some degree be left intact in terms of people having to reveal who they are and who the people are giving the money. But that doesn't change the fact that there's been a huge increase in the amount of money spent this year alone since that ruling. I'll give you a quick example. Back in 2002, there was about $31 million spent by outside groups. You won't even believe how much it's been increased to this year. About $400 million more than that.
Wow. And
so,
has that obviously favoured the Republicans?
Well, here's what's interesting, right, is the first thinking when this law came about, this ruling came about, is that that's what would happen. Interestingly enough, the law also affected unions, right? And unions tend to favor Democrats here in this country. So what's interesting is in terms of corporations, absolutely it's been favoring the GOP. That's not necessarily true, though, with some of the other groups, which has been fascinating to watch.
Okay, now you've written on the hip-hop generation declaring political independence. How big a factor was the youth vote for Barack Obama 2 years ago, and what are they going to be doing tomorrow?
I think the easiest way to explain how effective the youth vote was for Barack Obama 2 years ago is to simply say this, which is that Barack Obama would not be president of the United States without voters under 30. Yeah. And that's just a fact. When you look at the breakdown out of Iowa, which remember is the first state that made him a serious contender when he beat Hillary Clinton in the Iowa caucus, and it was a surprise at the time, he won by about 20,000 votes. 17,000 of those voters were first-time voters under the age of 25. He would not be president without the strength of young voters. He won a bigger share of the youth vote than any presidential candidate since they first began keeping records, recording the number of youth voters for different candidates. Now, of course, it got a little bit of trouble this year. The way I like to describe the Democrats' problem this year is that their biggest problem is a candidate whose name is not even on the ballot, and that's President Barack Obama, because there are a lot of older voters, particularly in rural areas, who are not a fan of the president right now. They're not his biggest fan. I say the second biggest problem Democrats have this year is that Barack Obama's name is not on the ballot, and that's because youth voters and African-American voters and voters who really do love the president might be less inclined to turn out, and I think that some of the polling is really showing that. That's what's being reflected.
But are they also disappointed in him? Is there also a problem in that there hasn't been the change that people were expecting? One of Barack Obama's biggest promises was that the lobbyists were going to be distanced from the lawmakers, and we've seen articles recently suggesting that that relationship is as murky as ever.
Actually, it's interesting because when all of the articles and polling started coming out a couple months ago showing that, saying the titles would say things like young voters disenchanted with Democrats, young voters disenchanted with Obama. And that made it sound like young voters are flocking to Republicans. That's really not what's happening. What you see happening is that a lot of younger people are just as disillusioned with the process as a lot of their parents are. The difference is a lot of younger voters are starting to more identify themselves as independents. The last data I saw from a couple of weeks ago shows that about 50% of voters under 30 now call themselves independents. And so I think that they're actually going to be a real wild card in this particular election. In fact, my book, the reason it was titled How the Hip-Hop Generation Declared Political Independence, is because even young black voters, like myself, you're seeing polling increase of the number of young blacks who are no longer identifying as Democrats, but call themselves independents and want the opportunity to vote based on the person and based on the issue, not based on the party label. I think that young voters are a real wild card this election.
So very briefly, will it be as bad for the Democrats as we're hearing?
I don't think so, actually. Democrats are probably going to hold on to the Senate. They're going to lose the House. But I'm one of those people that actually thinks that checks and balances are a good thing. So I actually think that the bloodbath that everyone's expecting is actually not going to come to be. It's going to be bad, but it's not necessarily going to be that bad.
Okay, Keli Goff, really interesting chatting to you, and we'll see what happens tomorrow.
Thank you.